Hello, I'm Renee Simms, and I'm the author of Meet Behind Mars, a story collection. So, Meet Behind Mars is a collection of 11 short stories, and the characters are primarily African American women. All of the characters are experiencing some type of alienation or feeling displaced, either because they've had to move to a new city and state due to a hurricane in their hometown, or because their neighborhood has been bused to a new school during school desegregation in the 1970s, or because they live in a predominantly white community in the Pacific Northwest and they're dealing with everyday racism and microaggressions that make them feel like the other. So these are some of the issues and themes that are being explored in the collection and things that I'm interested in as a writer.
Book lovers unite! I'm Demethius Jackson, and you're listening to the Chapter 1 podcast. The greatest stories ever written all begin with Chapter 1. In each episode, our guest authors will share their first chapters with you. On today's episode, we're going to be speaking with Renee Simms, author of Meet Behind Mars. That's such a cool name. I don't want to take too much time with this intro because Renee shares with us a very compelling reading and we have an even greater discussion afterwards. So stick around because it starts right now. All right, so I don't want to take up too much time with this. Okay, so I don't want to take up too much time with this intro. Because Renee gives a fantastic reading and we have a really interesting kind of psychological discussion afterwards. So stay tuned for that because it starts right now.
So the story I'm going to read is from the middle of the book. It's not chapter 1. It's not the first story in the collection. It's titled American Industrial Physics, and I chose it because it is one of the shorter stories. I also chose it because it looks at the type of alienation that one feels due to having to work at a job that maybe upon reflection you go, what was I doing? What was I contributing to society? So that's the type of alienation that's being explored in this story. American Industrial Physics. Dear editors, attached, please find my submission to Journal of American Industrial Physics for your special issue on narrative inquiry. I am emeritus professor of sociology from Wayne State University, but before obtaining my PhD, I worked for years as a veterinary assistant at Ford Motor Company. My submission is about that work. While organizational sociology literature includes numerous studies on automotive crash safety testing, there is little qualitative research focused on the veterinarians who cared for the crash test animals. My research indicates there were over 1,000 veterinarians and veterinary assistants used by the auto industry between 1955 and 1993. The job of these workers was to maintain and dispose of thousands of animals used in crash tests. I have interviewed several vet assistants, including the author of the narrative below. Thank you for considering my research for publication. All best, Dr. Johnetta Green. 1976, Ford River Rouge. Garth said that it was important to our research to have primates of all sizes, some that were over 100 pounds and some that were smaller, around 40 pounds or less. Precious was one of our smaller monkeys, part of AS Study 993-79, Findings of Forward Impact Crashes on Small Unharnessed Children. She was a long-tailed macaque with watery eyes, a trait that is common to her species, but one made worse by an eye infection that she had when she arrived from the Detroit Zoo. For 2 weeks after her arrival, I placed antibiotic drops into her eyes. I did this 4, maybe 6 times each day. The darling never fought or even squirmed. Macaques are generally agreeable, but she was so mild of temperament that Garth remarked, "That one there is just precious," a comment that everyone in automotive safety agreed with, and so the name stuck. But on the day that I prepared Precious for her final crash experiment, I couldn't bring myself to call her by that name. It was early summer and the mosquitoes nipped and hovered. I walked with Precious from automotive safety to the crash course building behind Building D. She crouched in her metal cage and ate green grapes. No matter how mild a test monkey is, you best believe it can turn violent. They can sense danger, and when that happens, watch out, all bets are off. Regina Coker, a vet assistant who wore nails that curved like ram's horns and which were painted a splendid shade of magenta, had her finger bit to the knuckle by a chimpanzee that got spooked by her nails. I expected no less from Precious, though she was silent as we walked to the courseway, her eyes focused like a penitent on the trees. Michigan summers are explosions of green, and on that day the auto plant's landscape appeared as lush as a rainforest. The plant is situated where the Rouge and Detroit rivers meet, and trees grow leafy from the rich soil. River Rouge is a city within a city. Precious looked around as if she understood its magnificence. She peered through the cage bars at the tractors hauling this and that, and at the gunmetal smoke that plumed upward from tool and die. There were a slew of buildings at River Rouge, and they sprawled for miles in each direction. The place had its own farmland and power plant. There was a complete railroad system and a fire department. It was possible to work there for decades, as I did, and never meet someone who had been there just as long. In fact, I never saw my son Douglas when he worked at Assembly. I'd gotten him that job thinking it would keep him off the streets, away from the crazies. I worked the day shift, arriving as the sky eased its way to lavender. Garth liked me to be there early to feed and bathe the monkeys. Strange how attached you can become to an animal. Each morning that I arrived, I'd look for Precious. She slept in a huddle with the other macaques. Like humans, they stayed in their clique, grooming each other, play fighting, and at night sleeping together on the cage floor, their limbs touching and protecting each other. Garth said that I had a calm demeanor that the animals took to. You got what they call mother wit, he told me. Truth is, I never have been a good mother. The last time I saw Douglas was in 1981 on the night that I put him out. He was on that stuff, all jittery and thin as a switch. He came in the house talking about job interviews and asking to borrow $40 to buy a shirt from Hudson's. Come on, Ma, help me out, he said. I won't get the job if you don't help me. He repeated this like an alarm and then grabbed me by my hair. In my mind, I could see only three options. We could fight, I could call the police, or I could make Douglas leave. My son was a good foot taller than me, and I'll admit I feared him a bit. When a woman thinks of fighting a man, she better have a weapon handy. Hot grits, like Al Green's ex-wife, or a stove lid, like Mrs. Breedlove in that Morrison book. You got to knock a rascal out. I had neither one. And I could never cause my child to go to jail, so that eliminated option two. Get the hell out, I told Douglas. He stood there staring me full in my face until my top lip started to sweat. You know what? He said. What's that? I asked him. Fuck this shit, he said. Then he left. Before he was gone, he stopped in my bedroom and rambled about, but I didn't go back there to check on him. I let him search for what he thought he might find. When Precious and I got to Building D, a new guard stood in front. She had a pretty brown face, but her hair was frosted that brassy blonde that the young girls liked back then. The Sunflowers is what I called these girls. You knew? I asked her. No, ma'am, she said. How long you been here? I've been here 3 years, but I'm new to this shift, she smiled. That's what I mean. There were so many people there doing so many different jobs. You couldn't know them all. I signed the clipboard and let her look at my badge. When she was satisfied we'd met the procedure, she let me into the building for what we in automotive safety called the march. It was a long walk down a linoleum-tiled hallway that ran through the center of the building. At the end, a glass door led to the courseway. I made that walk plenty of times. To tell the truth, I was relieved that activists started protesting what we did, though it wasn't our studies that initially got their attention, but an incident where our heaters malfunctioned one winter, heating up to over 100 degrees. When we found the monkeys the next day, they had either perished or were suffering from kidney failure. That was a tough day. It wasn't a job every person could do. I understood what we were doing, though, what Garth was trying to accomplish. We were saving people's lives. We used primates in our research because they're just like us. The injuries they got in those crashes were the same injuries we would get. It used to piss me off when Douglas would degrade what I did, like my job didn't help to feed and clothe him when he was young. I did what I did for him, and I did it for science, too. Still, I never liked thinking about what happened to the monkeys. I always said a quick prayer for an animal as I put the harness into place. The harness had 4 metal bars that splayed out like an X, and in the middle was a knob that screwed the harness on tight. We'd put test monkeys inside a car 3 times before the final ride so they could get used to it. In my prayers, I'd asked that their suffering would not be long. I've said the same prayer for Douglas many, many times. As I approached the courseway, Precious began rattling about in her cage and making a high-pitched noise. Uh-oh, I thought, this one's about to flip out. Shush, I told her, and handed her a grape. We stepped through the glass door that blazed white from the summer sun. You need help with this one? The test manager asked. Nah, she's a little one, I replied. I opened the cage and hoisted her delicate frame into my arms. Soon as I touched her, she calmed right down. She clutched my shirt in her fists. I gently pulled on her fingers to get her away from me and into the car's interior. Once she was in, she stood upright and was still. The harness was like a door that swung from left to right. In the past, I'd swing it shut and turn the knob. Precious would always look at me as I twisted and twisted and twisted. It would take me a while to secure it because she was so tiny. That day, we did not twist or swing. Instead, we just entered the car. Tennessee made child car seats mandatory the year after we published our study. I remember wishing Precious had shown more fight, but in the end, that wasn't her nature. She went into the car like she had on other occasions, as if we would see each other again.
Oh, wow. Oh, man. That didn't end the way I thought it would.
Oh,
Right on.
sorry.
You had me though. I was there. I was right there next to the car as you were speaking. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. So, the very first thing I have to ask you is Meet Behind Mars. That's such an interesting book title. How did you come up with that name? Or is there a story behind the creation of that name?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the title comes from a 1978 song by the R&B singer Cheryl Lynn. It comes from Star Love. And I won't sing it because I don't have a good singing voice. But and in the title story, Meet Behind Mars, the narrator explains that this was a song that she and her sister used to enjoy singing when they were teenagers, and that her sister was probably thinking about her boyfriends as she sang it. But the narrator says that when she heard that song, she heard a message that she could go anywhere in the world that she wanted to go, and she expected good things when she showed up. So that's where the title comes from. And I wanted each story and the subject matter of each story to communicate to the readers that this is a book that's interested in and concerned with Black women's visions, their stories, and their aesthetics. So it was important to me to have a title that also helped to communicate that idea.
Yeah. Well, I can also see a little bit of contrast with the title because it is kind of uplifting and being able to go anywhere, do anything, yet it kind of balances out the theme of isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So Mars is not a place that I've been to. Right. And I would think so. Yeah, it also picks up on that theme of being somewhere that feels disorienting or far away.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, born and raised. Was educated K through 12, went to undergrad in Michigan, went to graduate school in Michigan, and started practicing law there. And practiced for 4 years and decided that I wasn't as interested in that as I was in storytelling, both reading stories and writing stories. So I decided in my late 20s to leave the practice of law and to pursue creative writing. So it was something that I knew that I loved and that I was drawn to, but it wasn't something that I would say I grew up thinking I could do because there was no one in my immediate family who was a writer. There was no one in my extended family who was a writer, or in communities that I was a part of where I could see that as a role model.
Yeah.
So it was a second career choice for me, and I feel very fortunate that it's worked out because it was a leap of faith and a risk, kind of, or at least that's what the people around me were saying to me. You're doing what? You're leaving the practice of law to do what? It was a risk that I took, and with this book, I feel like the risk has paid off.
Yeah, absolutely. Kudos to you, because to step away from something that you've done for an extended period of time into a new direction that's unknown takes a lot of guts and a lot of faith that things are going to work out. So what was your first step in moving in that direction to become a writer?
So I didn't really know what I was doing, to be honest. And I think the very first step that I took was freelancing for local publications in Detroit. So there was a magazine called Left Bank. And I think I wrote an essay for them about the urban planning on Wayne State University's campus. Then I want to say it's 1996, summer of 1996, I went to a Black Writers Conference at Chicago State University. And the theme that summer was the Black Arts Movement. And so Nikki Giovanni was there, Mary Baraka was there, Marie Evans. And that's when I was determined, like, there's no turning back. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then shortly after that, I moved to Los Angeles and started hanging out in Leimert Park and started going to the World Stage Performance Gallery and meeting writers that way and learning about opportunities to publish, to be in anthologies, learning about writing organizations like Cave Canem through just meeting other writers and having that community.
Right on. And just all kind of grew from there.
Yeah. And then eventually I went back and went to school because I was like, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing. There's a whole professional side. So I went to get the MFA in creative writing, but I started with seeking out community first.
What was it that compelled you to write Meet Behind Mars? In other words, when did it transform from an idea into something real?
That's a great question. I started writing the stories individually, not thinking of them collectively as one unit. And then once I'd gotten enough of them published, I sat down and started to look at them, and I tried to see if there was anything that made them cohere. I didn't think of them as a book until enough of them were published, and I had several stories. And in fact, many stories that I'd written and published, I did not include in the collection because they didn't fit within the themes of the other stories. So it was really kind of a slow process of just focusing on the world of each individual story. And then once I had a mass of stories, then I started thinking about how do they fit together? How are they speaking to each other?
And these individual stories, did they just kind of come to you, or were you just in your everyday life and, oh, that's an idea for a story, and you started writing? Like, what was your process?
So usually for me, a story begins with a voice that I hear, a character. and a character who won't leave me alone. And so at some point I have to sit and start writing it. And in fact, I'm laughing right now because there's a character who's bugging me right now.
Right on.
And there's an image of someone dancing. And there's a family that is communicating with me. I know that sounds kind of spooky, but that's how it starts for me. Yeah. There's something that I hear, there's a voice, there's an image, and I can't let it go. And then eventually I sit down and write it.
That's very common for a lot of writers, including myself. Sometimes, you have a story in your head or you have a plot that you want to try to get down, but then there are other times when there's a story within you that needs to get out. And as you said, it won't leave you alone until you start sitting down and bringing it to life. And I think the coolest thing is when you set out to write and you have kind of a place in your head where you want to go, and then the story decides it wants to go in a different direction and takes you in a completely different turn. That happens often as well.
And that, I don't know about you, but I had to learn to trust that process.
Yeah.
And to find that it's fun, right? Because I'd be like, no, I was a control freak. I was like, no, this is not where I'm supposed to go.
Yeah, yeah.
But when you let go of that control, that's when you have, for me, the most inspired writing comes from those moments where there's a turn that you as a writer anticipate. And usually if that's true for you, then that's also the experience the reader's going to have, that they're going to be surprised by the turn the story makes.
Yeah.
And that's why we read, right? To be surprised.
So for the stories or for your characters, did you draw from your own personal experiences or from people that you know?
I'd say both. I like to think that I'm a pretty good observer and listener. And I think those are important skills for all writers to have. So I listen when people tell me stories. And if there's a story that resonates with me, it might end up inspiring something that I write. But I also want to have the freedom to go in the direction that the story is taking me in. Mm-hmm. So I never feel bound to facts or, true events, either in my life or in lives that I've observed and that have inspired the story. I always want to feel like I'm true to the characters, even though something from real life has inspired me and got me to start writing the story initially.
Mm. So as people start discovering the book and are reading it, what are some of the things that you want them to take away from it?
Well, to go back to something we were discussing just a few moments ago, as a reader myself, the reason why I read is to be surprised in some way, to learn something I didn't know, or to think about an issue or a subject matter in a new way, to come across a consideration of an idea that I didn't consider myself. Mm-hmm. So I like to be surprised. I like to be surprised by language also. So it's not just the ideas and the development of ideas and perspective, but it's also the language, word choice. I want to be surprised by word choice. I love to laugh. Some of the writers who I love the most, like Harriet Mullen, like Lori Moore, like Terrence Hayes, are writers who have a keen sense of humor. So those are all things that I would like to continue to develop in myself as a writer, and hopefully will be able to impart on my readers, if not in this book, in the books that are to come. I want them to enjoy it. I want them to have a good experience and maybe to think about Black women's lives in a way that they hadn't considered before reading it.
And I'm trying to think of a word to describe the story that you shared with us and maybe even your writing style. I think the word is multifaceted, because as I was listening to you read, and it's interesting, but then when you start going into the relationship that she's having with these animals, when she starts going into the emotions in the relationship that she has with both Douglas and with Precious, and then you start realizing the situation that she's in, I wasn't prepared for that. That was the surprising point for me. And that's when the story started going into a deeper level. And then when it ended the way that the story ended, yeah, I totally didn't see that coming. So I think you did a fantastic job with that. And I think that that's definitely a credit to your writing ability.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that I strive to do in all stories is to do exactly what you described, is to take it to that deeper level. So, and I've heard people say that there are always two stories in one story. I've heard someone else say that there are three stories but people who love animals, I've had people who love animals tell me, oh my God, I cried when I read that story. So that's kind of an easy one to trigger emotions for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it is the relationship with the son,
Mm-hmm.
which mirrors the relationship with the monkey, right? They're different. She's bonded with this animal who she's going to have to send off to die. And she can't keep her son close to her. And he could be dead for all she knows, right? So the resonance doesn't really come from me with the story with the animal, but from thinking about her relationship with the animal in comparison to the relationship with her son. So yeah, that is something that I strive to do, to have subtext and to have a primary story and then a secondary story that will help make sense of the primary story or to give it more resonance. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, you said multifaceted, and I am interested in like several genres. So Asali Solomon was someone who was generous enough to give me a blurb on the back of the book. And one of the things that she says is that these stories are by turns, realist, fabulous, satirical. And I think that's true. Like I do kind of mash up and do a pastiche of different genres because I like so many different kinds of storytelling. So that's also something that I am interested in as a writer.
What lessons did you learn from creating and publishing Meet Behind Mars that you'll take with you to the next project?
Oh, that's a great question. So many, especially when it comes to like publishing, right? To the business side and marketing and all of that. I think that there are many lessons that I'm continuing to learn on that front. But in terms of writing, what I'm working on now is a novel. And that's a very different process for me than writing a story because it's a long form, because you really talk about not knowing where it's going to end. like, where are we going? Where is the end of this? So I think one of the things I learned in writing Meet Behind Mars is that I have to trust the revision process and the editing process.
Mm-hmm.
I have a first draft of the novel, but I know it needs a lot more revision. And I think I'll be more open to changing things around dramatically and knowing that I can hold on to the first drafts that I have and go back to them if I need them, but to really be bold, right? And to take risks because I want it to be good. So I think that I learned to trust the revision process because that's where the magic happens. The first draft is just that. But that final draft and getting to the final draft, whoo, that's where all the work comes in.
Absolutely. And I mean, an editor is, God sent.
Yeah, absolutely. And someone who is going to read your work, that's very difficult to find. Someone who is good at editing and who will spend the time to push you to make your work better. Yeah, it makes all the difference.
Yeah, who believes in you and who believes in what you're doing.
Absolutely. Yep.
I think we all as writers have kind of like that trial and error period when we're trying to not only enhance our writing, but also find our voice as writers as well.
I know it's a process.
Yeah. I know with me personally, I started off, this all started by accident for me. I wrote a rhyming story in high school because I was learning about the old English epic adventures. And I think I was probably in my late 20s, early 30s. And I decided to publish it on Amazon. And it actually developed the following, this rhyming book. And so from there, I converted it into a full novel. And that was just probably the most painful experience I had, where I almost just gave it up because it was just so long and tiresome and tedious. And I didn't think that I was going to get through it. And then one day it was done. And
you got an audience.
Yeah. And I mean, it was just so many different growing pains with it. But as I look back on that process, I realized that it was necessary. Those were little cornerstones or key figures that was building the foundation to, where we are today. And I think that this book that you have now, Meet Behind Mars, is also pushing you in a direction.
Yeah, and that's something that I always tell my students. The way that you write today is not the way that you're going to write tomorrow or 5 years or 10 years from now. If you keep at it and you keep reading and you keep working to improve your own craft, you will evolve. And you just have to have that faith and put in the time and effort.
Well, thank you, Renee, for being on the show and speaking with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and really appreciate you doing this interview.
No problem. And let's get that website.
It's Renee Simms with 2 M's, ReneeSimms.com.
And with that, we're going to wrap up another episode. Thanks again to Renee for speaking with us today. If you have a question or comment for her or for me, or you know an author who you think would be a good fit for the show, let me know. Connect with me on social media. I'm on Facebook, YouTube, or send an email to info@ch1podcast.com. Check out ch1podcast.com, where you can listen to previous episodes and hopefully find your next favorite author. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, wherever you can download a podcast, we're there. Don't forget to leave a review, but most importantly, tell everyone you know about the show. Okay, that's it for me. You all stay awesome. Till next time.